I'm here along Turnagain Arm this gorgeous morning. There's a whole bunch of ice that's flowing out to the sea here. It's going really slow. There's some great reflections. The sun's just coming up. Just a beautiful day. I'm going to go down here to get a little closer to the action. So I'm just going to climb down a cliff here, or slide down the cliff, whatever's easier. I just want to get out here where I can get a little bit closer to the ice. And here we are. So right away I know that I'm going to want to use a long exposure to get that ice moving and see some of these reflections. Before I get my tripod set up, I want to find the composition first. So do I want to be low like this? Or do I want to be up higher like that? I want to go with something like that. Wide. Maybe something like that. Look at that. Ice moving right in front. That's a pretty cool setup. But the first one I'm going to do is this, with all this ice in the foreground. So I'm going to stay low here. I want to have a little bit of separation between this stationary piece of ice and the ice that's moving out there. So knowing that I want to be fairly low, I'm measuring my tripod, and the tripod's going to be about here. So rather than have it set up fully, I'm going to lower it to be about that height rather than moving it up and down all the time. So there's my first composition. Seeing how that's overexposed at the top there, I know that I want to use a graduated neutral density filter. I'm going to use my Stingray filters. So I'm putting on a filter ring because I'm in deep shade here and I'm overexposed out there. I'm going to go for a 3-stop hard edge filter, which is this little guy right here. Slide it down until I can see it. Bingo, right there. Now I'm going to use my cable release. That's because I don't want to shake the camera. I'm at ISO 100, f/18, a sixth of a second. And I'm going to use mirror lockup. So there's our first exposure. Histogram has room to move over to the right. I want as much detail as I can get in the higher area here. So I'm simply going to overexpose by a third of a stop and see how that looks. The histogram looks good because I've got room over there on the right. So I'm going to make a couple exposures like that. And so that's my first shot, sixth of a second. But now, as I look over to my right behind me, the sun there is just gorgeous. So now I'm going to swing out over here. I'm going to make a different composition because I want to see that reflection in the water. Plus I want to see the ice moving. That ice moving is really cool. I've got this cloud in the lower right that is kind of neat looking. But I don't know that I want to go that wide. I'm thinking I'm going to want to go in something like that, so I can see that ice moving in there. I'm also going to move the split neutral density, graduate neutral density down to cover up the mountain there, like that. That makes the exposure that much better. It'll be interesting to see how much motion I really need to get the ice to move. I don't think I need much. Notice how fast that ice is moving. So even a half of a second would probably do well. And in order to gauge that, all I'm doing honestly is licking my finger, so to speak, and just guessing. I'm guessing that that's moving pretty fast, so I don't need to have much. So we'll make our first exposure, 1/6 of a second f/18. And the histogram looks very good. I can even open it up a little more. I'm going to overexpose it by 1 stop. So that exposure looks good on the histogram, and that's what counts. I want to look and see how that ice is moving. So I'm going to enlarge it. And you can definitely see that the ice is moving. But everything else is sharp. So that was a pretty simple shot. Now I'm just going to play with that a little bit and get tighter and wider. Notice that I don't care for a lot of sky. The sky is nothing but blue up there. So why do I want to show a lot of blue sky? I don't. So I crop in. But see, I'm looking at my edges and my corners. And that's all sacred ground. So as I look at this, I want to make sure nothing is in the corners or edges of where I'm at. I want to get a longer exposure and show this ice moving. So in order to do that, I'm going to switch to my wine country camera system. So here I'm going to use the wine country camera system for my graduated neutral density filter. And I also have the option of putting on a regular neutral density, which will help with that ice movement, making it a longer exposure. The nice thing about this, it has a built-in polarizer, so that already gives me 1.5 stops less light. So if we put this big monstrous thing on there, then looking through the camera, I'm going to rotate the polarizer till it looks the very best. Because we're 90 degrees from the sun, so that looks good. I'm keeping the foreground icebergs in the frame because they are stationary. So I'm using a polarizer. Now I'm going to get out a graduated neutral density filter. I'm going to go with a 2-stop hard edge. ISO 100. I get 1/4 of a second. It's a decent exposure. Histogram can go a little bit more, so I'm going to open it up 2/3 of a stop on aperture value, 1/2 of a second exposure. Histogram looks good, I'm not clipping anything, and it's a decent image. Now that I got that shot, I just really want to see that ice moving a lot. So now I'm going to get out my other bag of tricks, which is a neutral density bag. If I'm currently at 1/2 of a second, which is in yellow, and I use a 5-stop filter, I'll get 16-second exposure. 16 seconds is a long time. I'm going to lick my finger, and all I really want is like a 4-second exposure. So if I want a 4-second exposure, I need to get 1/8 of a second out of the camera. So I'm simply going to adjust my aperture to where I get 1/8 of a second. F10 gives me 1/8 of a second exposure on my camera. So that's what I'm going to use in manual mode, 1/8 of a second at F10 ISO 100. And it gives me a good exposure. So now that I know that 1/8 of a second at F10 is a good exposure, I can slide in my, so very simply, slide in the 5-stop and go 4 seconds at F10. Even though it's a 4-second exposure, the exposure is identical, absolutely identical to the 1/8 of a second one, because it was just a longer shutter speed using that. And notice how the difference between the ice, 1/8 of a second, 4 seconds. This is the 1/8 of a second exposure, and this is the 4-second exposure. Which do you like? Now, is 4 seconds too much, too long? I don't think so. I think it's just right. And as I always say, if you think the photo's good, then it's good. Don't let anybody else tell you anything different. So now I might play around with this exposure a little bit. Maybe 4 seconds is too long. So if 4 seconds is too long, well, let's just manually move it to 2 seconds. That's one stop of light. So instead of F10, I need to open it up 3 clicks to F7.1. And then we'll go with a 2-second exposure. There's a 2-second exposure. So how do you like the ice of the 2-second exposure versus the one at 4 seconds versus the one at 1/8 of a second? One thing I always do is I always shoot at least 2 frames, usually more, 3 or 4 frames of the exact same subject, exact same exposure, just so I'm sure that one of them is sharp in case I kick the tripod or something like that. Now let's go to 1 second. 1 second is half as much light as 2 seconds. So if I reduce the exposure by half from 2 seconds to 1 second, I need to increase the exposure on the other end, either by ISO, increase the ISO from 100 to 200, or in this case, since I'm on a tripod and I don't need a lot of depth of field because everything's on infinity anyway, then I'm just going to go from 7.1 to F5. And I say everything's on infinity because I'm using about a 35 millimeter lens, and the closest thing to me is 40 feet away. So I don't really need a lot of depth of field. So now there's 1 second exposure. So what do you think of the ice? This is all about the ice, right? Is the ice moving too much or too little? At 1 second versus 2 seconds versus 4 seconds versus 1/8 of a second. So beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Do what you like. The ice moving as it is, I'm now going to quickly remove the 5-stop neutral density so I can see in the camera a little bit better. And now I'm going to zoom in so that I get some reflection, but I also still want this ice in front of me to be stationary. So we're going to see what looks good here. That's okay, but because these mountains on the left here, they want to take me out of the frame, so I don't like that composition. So I'm going to move over here with that ice. Now I got something. Ice in the lower right here leads me into the frame. I don't know if I want that mountain back there or not. I'm going to leave it in for now, and I can always crop it out later. With that composition. So now, sliding in this 5-stop neutral density, see how easy it is now to replace that 5-stop filter? It's a whole lot easier than screw-in ones. Wine Country camera, it's the best. I'm in manual at F5 at the 1 second exposure. So now there's a 1 second exposure. Look at that ice. Now I'm going to go to 2 seconds because I think, well, maybe 2 seconds will be good. And again, adjust my f-stop down in order to compensate for that 2 second exposure. And there's 2 seconds. Now I'm going to go to a 4 second exposure and move my f-stop down 1 stop in order to compensate. Ooh, so look at that. Now the question is, do you like the 4 second exposure or the 2 second exposure or the 1 second exposure? Interesting. With that 4 second exposure, I really like that look with the reflection of the mountains in there. So that's what we did here on Turnagain Arm. We photographed the ice moving, slow exposures, a lot of depth of field, and then there's stationary ice as well with the mountains in the background. It was a glorious morning here. It was really glorious because I kept hearing an owl up behind us, up in the mountains up there. Ultimately, this 4-second exposure is the image I chose as the best for what I like. Hey, take a look at many other images from spring along Turnagain Arm at my placesofalaska.com website, or you can also get it from the portfolio menu from schultzphoto.com. There you can read about history about the area, and I also narrate about some other images I made along the arm. I'd be very grateful if you click the like and subscribe buttons if you enjoyed this video and want to see more. Please tell me in the comments section what you'd like to see. I hope to see you here in Alaska and have fun shooting. All the best.